Welcome back, vinyl community. Sounds of Channel 1 Studio on deck today. Reggae Spotlight style. Sounds of Ernest Wilson on deck. Very soulful Ernest Wilson with I Know Myself, recorded at Channel 1 Studio. Channel 1 had an enormous impact on Jamaican music, virtually defined it for close to a decade, from the mid-70s to the early 80s, was founded by four Chinese Jamaican brothers, the Kim brothers. The eldest was Joseph, aka Jojo, who passed away September 20th, 2018 of liver cancer, hence the reason for this video. As well, there was his younger brothers, Ernest Kim, who was quite technically minded, repairing equipment, machines, electronics, as well as Polly and Kenneth, who had a bicycle repair shop. The Kims, who were part of a tradition of Chinese Jamaican families that had a large impact on reggae. There was Herman Chin Loy with the Aquarius label, who released Aquarius Dub, one of the first dub albums, as well as being the first to record Augustus Pablo. There was the Chin family of Randy's, which is now VP Records, the largest reggae label in the world, as well as Leslie Kong, who was the first man to record both Jimmy Cliff and Bob Marley. The Kims ran a business of running jukeboxes and slot machines. In the early 70s, the Jamaican government outlawed slot machines, so they were looking for another source of revenue. They were running a sound system and decided to build a recording studio, inspired by some of the other studios that were getting involved in the reggae business at that time. They set up shop at the premises of 29 Maxfield Avenue in a rough part of the Kingston ghetto. 29 Maxfield Avenue would become one of those iconic reggae addresses that every fan knows from the credits on the back of their album sleeves, right up there with 13 Brentford Road of Studio One, and you can kind of see the similarity there between Studio One and Channel 1. Now, the studio was set up as they wanted to set up as state-of-the-art studio as possible with the best equipment. Originally, it was 4 tracks. They spent a lot of time trying to get the sound quite right. It opened in the early 70s. They've offered a try it first before you buy to any producers who wanted to record there, giving them free recording sessions to see if they liked it. One of the initial hits that came out of there was reportedly an early hit by Gregory Isaacs, All I Have Is Love, producer Phil Pratt. But it took a couple of years to get the sound quite right. Apparently there was an entire album with Alton Ellis that had to be scrapped because the sound wasn't quite right. They definitely wanted to focus on the sound of the drums, get it clear and balanced and just right. By 1975, sound was in place and a revolution in reggae was about to begin. Our early hits came out like Iroy, Welding. Iroy would also function as something of an in-house arranger for a time at Channel 1. The original engineer of the studio was Sid Bucknor, but within a year or so, Ernest Kim himself took over, and later on a host of others would occupy the engineering chair. But the tune that really kicked things off for the studio was a song by the Mighty Diamonds called The Right Time, with that snare drum hit on the intro, signaling the start of a sound that would become called Rockers. Now, by this time, the Kim brothers had assembled their own house band, which would eventually be called the Revolutionaries. As in typical Jamaican fashion, it was kind of pulled from a host of available session musicians, including Ranchy McLean on bass. Sly Dunbar on drums was particularly crucial in developing a rhythm that would be called rockers, with an accent on certain beats of a bar, reportedly inspired by rock music, hence the name Rockers. This was in response to a producer called Bunny Lee, who in the early part of the 70s was hitting hard with a style of rhythm he had developed, or his house band, the Aggravators, had developed, called flying cymbals. The Hukim brothers took note of this, wanted to tweak the rhythm to suit their own studio, their own house band, and soon they were cranking out hits at a furious rate, with the Mighty Diamonds' iconic Right Time soon defining the sound, as well as massive hits like Ballistic Affair by Leroy Smart, appearing on Channel 1's Well Charged label, as well as hiring the studio out to other producers. The Hukim brothers soon moved into their own production with labels like Well Charge, and also Hitbound, and later JJ. Disco Mix was another label. They soon began issuing records under the name of the Revolutionaries house band. Jojo Hukum, ever the astute businessman, figured they could maximize the amount of maximize studio time with the musicians laying down rhythms, which they could then record the vocalists, and also put out a series of dubs or instrumental dubs to basically issue the same material again for the same costs. Here's Hitbound, the Revolutionaries. You can tell kind of the more militant image coming into play with the house band named the Revolutionaries. Tracks like IRA, Angola, another one. Don't know if you can see that, the Well Charged label there. As I said, they began issuing a huge series of dub albums, many. Here's one. This is called Revolutionary Sounds. Somebody's cut out the center of the cover to make it look like a 12-inch single sleeve. But here's the proper cover. And track titles like MPLA, Leftists, Victory. You get the militant image, again played up on some of the dub album sleeves. This one is Aggravators Meet the Revolutionaries at Channel 1 Studio. This is Bunny Lee Productions. And the Aggravators and the Revolutionaries are the musicians who also provide 90% of the backing music on records in Jamaica. The musicians on the set are as follows: drums, Sly Dunbar, Carlton Davis; bass, Robbie Shakespeare, Lloyd Parks. Their stint together in the Revolutionaries would be the first regular pairing of Sly Dunbar and Robbie Shakespeare, who are still working together today. Iconic bass and drum partnership fueled countless reggae hits, and countless Revolutionaries dub albums appeared, like Reaction and Dub on the Cha Cha label out of the UK. Jonkanu Dub, the Revolutionaries. All these would bear the very typical logo, recorded at Channel 1 Studio. 29 Maxfield Avenue, engineers Ernest Hukim, Barnabas, Les McKenzie. One of the most iconic dub albums was Vital Dub, which appeared on Virgin. The Hukim brothers and Channel 1 forged a link with Virgin, and saw some of their product released internationally. This contained dubs to many of the tracks on the Mighty Diamonds' Right Time album. They also began some format innovations. One of the first was what's called the Channel 1 Economic Package. This is a 7-inch single with 4 tracks that plays at 33 RPM. Pride and Ambition, Leroy Smart, backed with Badness Don't Pay. Unfortunately, this format wasn't too successful, but one that the brothers adopted very quickly on was the 12-inch Disco Mix single, which was much more successful. Here's the iconic Channel 1 12-inch single sleeve, and the song is Truly by the Jays, updating of our Marcia Griffiths song from Studio One. Some say this is the first 12-inch single released in Jamaica. As with many of these things, it's kind of contested. But definitely one of the earliest ones. Channel 1 definitely popularized the format, took advantage of the extra space on the record to add vocal and DJ and dub versions. So another style of sleeve on the Hitbound label. This one is the Wailing Souls, Jah Give Us Life, Don't Feel No Way, backed with War. Classics from them, sound system copy with markings on there. By now, so popular was the rhythm patterns that the Revolutionaries house band had created, the rockers style rhythm, that it inspired the movie Rockers, adopted by all the other producers by this point, included Junior Biles' Fade Away, which was one of the early songs recorded at the studio. By 1977, the studio was in full swing. Unfortunately, tragedy was about to strike. Polly Hookham was murdered on the beach during an early morning dominoes game, apparently. Joseph Hookham fell into a depression, left for New York to set up business interests there, releasing records out of there. Studio One continued, but sort of lost heart, lost some of their sense of camaraderie they had between the artists and the arrangers and producers and engineers. This allowed a rival studio like Joe Gibbs to kind of step into the gap and for a time achieve ascendancy. In 1979, the brothers revamped the studio, upgrading it to 16 tracks, soon began hitting again with the early dancehall sound. By now, Sly and Robbie had gone off to kind of start their own production team. The Revolutionaries had kind of given way to a new session band called the Revolutionaries, which would define the next stage of reggae music, the early dancehall phase. And they soon began hitting with a series of producers like Henry Junjo Laws and many others, and started hitting with artists like Sammy Dread, classic Roadblock album on the Hitbound label. Mixed at Channel 1, rhythm track recorded at Channel 1. Classic album there. Barry Brown's iconic Far East, heavily versioned song. One of the key elements of early dancehall was the reusing, that's on the JJ label for JoJo. Barry Brown's Far East, updating this old Studio One rhythm. This was kind of an element of reggae that Channel 1 furthered and popularized, the reusing of previous rhythm tracks. Again, this was a cost-saving measure. The musicians all knew these rhythm tracks from the old hits from places like Studio One, and they could pick it up instantly and not have to learn new chords, new tunes. Incensed Coxsone Dodd of Studio One to a great deal, to the point where he began hitting back with revised version and updated versions of his own rhythm tracks with younger artists, and sparked what came to be known as dancehall. Another one, Wailing Souls, Firehouse Rock, classic from them. Another group that did great work at Channel 1, and produced by Henry Junjo Laws, backed by the Revolutionaries, recorded at Channel 1, mixed by Scientist, another one who mixed many of the Studio One dub tracks. Here's a rare picture of Joseph Hookham from the debut issue of Reggae Quarterly magazine, photos by Beth Lesser, 1984. Sly and Robbie in front of Channel 1 studio. Rare picture of Brother Kenneth down there. By the mid-80s, the sound was changing again. The digital revolution was soon to come. Joseph Hookham began to lose most of his interest in music. Some of the brothers went into other businesses and eventually settled permanently in America. But for a time, Channel 1 studio was the place where every producer in Jamaica, you can pick up, it seems, virtually any record recorded between the late 70s and early 80s, and it seems you can see Channel 1 on the credits. But today, unfortunately, the studio is a dilapidated, vacant shell of a building, long since fallen into disrepair and not used since the early 80s. There's a nice anthology of Channel 1 that appeared on VP Records, Reggae Anthology, the Channel 1 story. Very informative liner notes by the late Dave Hendley. This has been my look at Channel 1, one of the most influential labels in the history of reggae. I'm going to leave you again with the voice of Ernest Wilson. I know myself. I know myself. When you found the way, you can find peace in all things. Violence, hostility shall disappear from your being. Peace, final community.